Hello, I'm Michael Hainsworth. As Donald Trump's trade wars vacillate every day, the C.D. Howe Institute has struck a trade crisis working group. Its goal? Provide insight and advice to Canadian policymakers about how to proceed during these unprecedented times. The key conclusions from the fifth meeting? Strengthen and de-risk the economy, avoid or limit retaliation, support businesses hit by Trump's tirades, and pursue alliances with like-minded nations. Since that April 7th meeting, Canada is largely on board with this strategy. How do we deploy it? Joining us now are two members of the Trade Crisis Working Group, former MPP Mitzie and former Alberta Premier Jason Kenney. They're both senior fellows at the Institute. Thank you for joining us.
Good to be here, Michael. And we're also co-chairing the working group, so very honored to do so.
Yes, thank you.
Mitzie, when the working group recommends unleashing major economically sensible projects to de-risk the economy, what do those projects look like?
Well, Michael, Canada has hundreds of projects on the books that need to be advanced, whether that's energy projects, climate-related projects, of course, major critical infrastructure projects. And part of de-risking is really looking at how we advance those projects in a timely way, whether that's through the regulatory process and working with governments. And by that, I mean each level. So the federal, provincial, as well as at the municipal level as well, where oftentimes projects have to meet certain community thresholds. And part of de-risking is also being ready from a skills and talent perspective, making sure that we have capacity across our country to fulfill these projects in a timely way. There is a lot that we can be doing when we look inward and we look at our own capacity. And I think that what this trade crisis or this economic crisis has done, it has forced us as Canada to look at our own markets, at our own projects, and to say, how can we advance and strengthen our economy within our own capacity where we are making decisions and calling the shots?
I think what a lot of us are talking about when we think of major projects have been some of the subjects dominating the election debate, namely energy infrastructure, because by far our greatest energy product is energy, and the greatest literally untapped wealth that we have in Canada is oil and gas as well as minerals. And so, we're looking back at the death or cancellation of several major oil and gas pipelines and major LNG, liquefied natural gas projects. Now, thankfully, we can see the difference that these things make with the completion of the Trans Mountain expansion, which is an additional 500,000 barrels a day of oil shipped from Edmonton to the Port of Vancouver, and then being sold at the global rather than the discount U.S. price. That has made a measurable increase in the entire Canadian economy, that one project. So imagine if we had two or three of that scale. Also, good news, we're finally, after a decade, about to see later this year the commissioning of the LNG Canada project at Kitimat, our first large-scale LNG project. They're sitting there, that consortium, waiting to decide whether or not to go ahead with phase two. And there are several other major prospective LNG projects both on the east and the west coast. If we could send the right regulatory messages, the economics would definitely work around those LNG projects and prospectively around oil and gas. There's a lot of talk here about a fully Canadian east-west oil pipeline, so we don't have to pass through the United States, so that central Canada is not dependent on the tender mercies of Donald Trump or Washington to have fuel to run their economy. And then finally, we haven't moved a shovel on the Ring of Fire. And in the last 10 years, there have been apart from the Jansen potash mine in Saskatchewan, no large-scale mining projects launched in Canada. We should not be dependent on the Chinese for lithium, copper, and other critical minerals when it comes to, for example, electrification.
Okay, those sound like large infrastructure projects, which also sound like long-tail solutions to a problem we're trying to address today. So as a former premier, you're acutely aware of the inter-provincial trade barriers that exist. How do we tear them down after generations of protectionism?
Well, it takes political will. And let me, I led by example on this, and I'm not doing this to toot my own horn, but to explain how much stasis, how much paralysis there is on this issue. At the 2019 Council of the Federation, I announced that Alberta was, instead of haggling, instead of horse trading, we were going to unilaterally eliminate 95% of our exemptions under the Canada Free Trade Agreement to go to basically full free trade. The only things we kept were the ability to not import toxic waste. I thought that might be a political hard sell. And supply management, which is a big part of interprovincial barriers. So we did that, and I hoped that that kind of leadership by example, one province doing that unilaterally, realizing that there are benefits to unilateral free trade, I thought that would spread a positive contagion across the country. But apart from Manitoba, nobody followed suit. And I'll tell you why. And I'm sure Mitzie, as a like me, a recovering politician, will confirm this. No politician in Canada going door to door during or between elections has ever heard a constituent say, you know, you guys really need to move forward on the regulatory harmonization chapter of the Canada Free Trade Agreement. Like, this is
Right, but
never
times have changed.
this is never a top of mind issue. And so, but there, behind every exception, for every professional regulatory body that's doing some gatekeeping, for example, every industry, that the road builders that want preferences for procurement in their province, behind every exception, there is at least one small interest group, and there's no countervailing public pressure to just go whole hog on internal trade, realize the promise of the Federation. I think the solution is partly for the feds to use their constitutional superpowers, which is the whole darn reason the Confederation was created as an economic union 155 years ago.
Well, it's also like, I mean, the commitments have been made by the feds and by the provinces to do this by July, which is fast approaching. And I think that, you know, one of the aspects to this domestic economy and saying, hey, let's actually, you know, topple some of these barriers that we've put between provinces, and let's get our own house in order when it comes to interprovincial trade. It's been a conversation that has been on the table for quite some time, as Jason has said, but this crisis has really put the fire under the feet of all levels to say, let's get this done. And you know, one aspect that oftentimes most Canadians don't even know that they're interprovincial trades until they're trying to move across, and they have a certification in one province that's not recognized in another, even though they obviously have been doing that particular skill or trade or profession for quite some time. And so it is. Let's not let a crisis go to waste, and this is an opportunity for us to accelerate this.
And I'll just say in one sentence, the biggest, fastest, easiest thing we could do would be for all provinces to accept the regulations of other provinces automatically, so mutual recognition, unless there is some very significant difference in regs that they could work up. But that would cover 90% of regs. They've done this, my God, in the 28 member states of the European Union. We can do it here.
This sort of ties into where I wanted to go next, because I can imagine it would contribute to the issue, as the working group points out, that adopting measures to boost productivity is critical as well. This is something the Institute's been banging a drum on low productivity for years now. So is that part of the solution? And if it's not the full solution, what else do we do?
Yeah, I think that this is a really important moment when we need to examine Canada's productivity. We know it's been lagging, and the CD Howe Institute has been, you know, leading the charge on the conversations around that. You know, it's been very easy for us to turn to our neighbors to the south as a you know, abundant market. Well, now we have to actually re-examine that, and it presents an opportunity, in fact, for businesses, because, you know, the response here is not solely within government. Businesses also have an opportunity to look at new markets, to become more global, to invest in their own infrastructure internally, and new technologies, and really.
But how do you get them to open the wallet at a time of uncertainty when the greatest risk to capital expenditure is uncertainty?
Well, at the end of the day, we know that we have a future that we're working towards as Canadians. And yes, there is an immediate uncertainty, and we get that because, the headlines are just really driving consumer confidence and all of those decisions that really, really matter. But I believe in Canadian businesses, and I believe that they will take a look at this particular moment and say, where are the other markets that we can be tackling, and come up with strategies and solutions. They can't do it alone. We have an international trade commission network across the globe in many key markets. All of these types of things need to be activated right now to support Canadian industry and Canadian businesses. And I think that this is an opportunity for us to really look at it. We're not going to abandon the United States as our nearest market, but it's an opportunity to look for others as well.
And Michael, I would just say on productivity, look, we've been talking about this for 40 years, right? Decline in productivity and competitiveness. And now it's reached a crisis that Donald Trump is exploiting, because we have had the low, with the exception of Luxembourg, in the 34 members of the OECD, the Club of Industrialized Countries, we have the worst record in per capita GDP growth over the past decade. We now have the equivalent per capita GDP of Alabama, the poorest of the 50 United States. That is the measure. That's like I think it's a $23,000 difference between an average Canadian and an average American in what they make. That is the consequence of this productivity crisis. We are not going to solve this. If the tax gap between Canada and our biggest competitor continues to grow, forget about Donald Trump's threats on sovereignty, which I think are appalling. The biggest threat to our economy is that the tax delta between Canada and the United States continues to grow. He's about to pass through Congress another huge reduction in business and personal taxes. That giant sucking sound you hear will be more capital and investment fleeing to the United States, particularly in tech and innovation sectors. So we have to get competitive on taxes. That means getting fiscally responsible like we used to be under different governments, different colors, and means deregulating to build those major projects. If we could get 2 or 3 more major projects done, like Trans Mountain expansion and LNG Canada, that would be a lift to the Canadian economy of a couple of $100 billion a year. If we got free trade internally, a lift of another potential $90 to $100 billion, got the incentives right on taxes. We get those 3 big things done, we can turn this around, in my view.
I think it's also our people, right? Because I think that that's the biggest competitive advantage that we have is we have, fantastically educated labor force, skilled labor force. But are we making the most of that? Many of these projects that are on the books often can't advance because we don't have the skilled individuals to fulfill those roles, and so this is also an opportunity for us to invest in the skills and the talent that's needed here in Canada to make those advances that we want to see. We obviously are a country of immigrants. That's something I'm personally committed to and passionate about. And how do we make sure that across the country, we talked about interprovincial trade, interprovincial barriers. Some of those things need to be collapsed, that people can move freely across this country and get to the roles that are so desperately needed. And I can't be here as part of the C.D. Howe Institute without talking about the role of women. 52% of Canada's population are women, and we know that many of these high demand areas are areas that also need to open up to women and make sure that they have a role and an entry point into these high demand opportunities as well.
I want to talk about a point that sort of raised an eyebrow for me when I had read the communique, which was that the working group is advising negotiators to avoid retaliation or limit it. How do we do that without bending the knee?
Yeah, I think that's a really perhaps the central debate right now on how best to respond to the Trump tariffs and threats. I will confess that I'm not part of the consensus in the group on that because I do believe Donald Trump disrespects weakness. He sees it as an invitation for more aggression, and he respects strength. And I think probably the reason for, I'm a politician, or a recovering one. So I tend to look at things through a political lens, and I look at the kind of political psychology that animates Donald Trump. Most of the folks at the Institute, most of our fellow senior fellows and scholars are economists, and they're absolutely right on when you're doing the economic scoring that reciprocal tariffs would, they hurt us too. But I'm looking at this strategically, and I do think that that all of the major Canadian political parties are right to have supported dollar for dollar reciprocal tariffs, to say we are not going to be bullied, and there will be targeted pain, and wherever possible, those those reciprocal tariffs have to be targeted on imports that are critical to Canada, that are going to have a minimal cost. And I think the government has done a reasonably good job of selecting a schedule of counter tariffs that do that. In the long run, though, let's face it, we're not going to win a trade war with an economy that's 12 size bigger than ours, and that's why we need to find other ways of solving this.
The only thing I would say, just with the wonderful discussions we've been having around the trade crisis task force, is the longer view. So it's not just whatever the news headline is of the day or of the moment. The reality is that within 18 months we have an existing trade agreement with the United States and with Mexico that is going to need to be looked at. And many of our advisors around the table are saying, well, actually, is that really what this is all about? And are we getting ready for renegotiations? And so it's keeping that longer, mid to longer term goal in mind, while of course, remaining steadfast, in terms of Canada's sovereignty and our nationhood and the values that we hold. At the same time, we want to make sure that we're really setting ourselves up well for that renegotiation of the U.S. MCA.
So if we go ahead with, dollar for dollar tariff response, tell me about what we do with that dollar. How do we support the resiliency and the continuity of businesses affected by U.S. tariffs? Do we just funnel the counter tariff money directly to them?
Myself, I would say at least some tax relief, because that's productivity enhancing. But let's not get addicted to that, because let's hope that the counter tariffs are very short term. So my caution would be, let's not build another permanent entitlement into the Canadian economy that we can ill afford, that people get used to. So I think we should, whatever we do with it, signal that this is a very temporary support.
And we don't want to impair the Canadian economy in any permanent way with what is happening right now. And so we want businesses to keep their employees, and we want them to keep going and to continue to operate. I would also be mindful of looking at sectors. When we think of healthcare, even finance, 80% of healthcare or female led occupations, even finance, it's 60% women, but oftentimes, at lower paid on the scale. And so I think it's also important that we apply that lens and we look at, what aspects of the economy are most impacted. How do we continue to keep that continuity of our economy and businesses while we, move through the effects of the tariffs on an immediate basis?
I mentioned at the beginning of our time together that a lot of what you're advising since the time at which you first met it and provided it to the point at which we're having this conversation has been widely accepted as yes, this is the right way forward. But I was interested specifically in the use of the word carefully when advising carefully pursuing alliances with like-minded nations. Canada, European Union, Asian nations, we've all been having these discussions with each other. So why is carefully a critical element to your advice?
Well, I'll just pop out and say, because the largest market in the world, in that sense, the low-hanging fruit target to focus on export diversification would be China, which is at least as problematic as the United States. And I'm quite concerned that coming out of this crisis, there will be we were starting gradually in this country in the past 10 years to realize that we had put way too many eggs in the Chinese market basket, that is a capricious regime. Look at the tariffs that they've imposed now for a third time in a decade on our agricultural producers for political reasons. It's a aggressive totalitarian state focused on territorial expansion in Asia, starting with Taiwan and the South China Sea, that is engaged in massive industrial espionage, gross and repeated violations of the World Trade Organization obligations, massive subsidies of their export products, currency manipulation, political interference in Canada and elsewhere. And I think it would be a huge mistake to revert to this policy setting of Canada 10 years ago, which is to say China is the answer to all of our trade questions. It's not. I think we need to be much more linked up with emerging, but first of all, in Asia, with Japan and South Korea, yes, with Southeast Asia, with Europe, of course, and we have trade agreements with the TPP and CETA, so we're starting from a good position there.
Right, and carefully is also nurturing those relationships and really realizing through trade commissions and the business contacts and the global nature of markets that Canada is on the ground in those areas and doing deals and making those trade relationships and the agreements that are in place realized. And so that's something that the conversation has been centered around. At the same time, we are geographically tied to the United States, and it is still a huge global player. And our relationship is while it is changing, is permanent because we are geographically tied, and we want to be mindful of that.
I think that's a good point. This is not a partisan point. And let me preface my comment by saying I'm very hawkish on how to deal with Trump, and I'm quite I'm willing to accept that his threats at some point in his mind have been serious. But when Prime Minister Carney said 3 weeks ago, essentially he said the relationship with the United States is over. I thought that was an imprudent overstatement. Mitzie is right. As 80% of our exports go to the United States, we are inextricably linked in to the continental trade and the U.S. market. And there's nothing we can do to wish that away. Yes, we can and must redouble our efforts to diversify export markets. That starts with major projects. That starts with pipelines. It starts with road and rail to the coasts and big projects. But it doesn't end there because like it or not, we are going to be dominated by the U.S. trade relationship, and we've got to figure that one out.
It was also about pointing out that there's an attempt to redraw the world trade system right now and centering it around the wishes of the United States. And where that leaves Canada is in a vulnerable place without other allies. I think that's also the point that was trying to be made by Prime Minister Carney, and that's really what the CDAO has said. It's we've got to also look at other markets and other relationships and not be so overly reliant and overly dependent on our geographic neighbor. It's also, I think, it's about businesses, taking up the challenge because it is more challenging to seek global markets. You've got to build relationships, and it takes time to do that. But if we put our efforts there, I believe that in the long run, it's going to pay off.
Donald Trump ripped up NAFTA, forced us to renegotiate a new agreement, and then ripped that one up too. How do we negotiate with someone who doesn't respect his own agreements?
You asked the right question, but we have no option. We have to have some agreement, even with an unreliable partner, is better than no agreement. And it has to be a comprehensive agreement on both security and trade, a political and not just a trade agreement. And that will be the challenge of the next Canadian government.
In the current negotiating climate, let's find a win-win-win where Canada, Mexico, and the United States all come away with wins.
Jason Kenney is an Institute Senior Fellow and former Premier of Alberta. Mitzie Hunter is a Senior Fellow at the Institute and a former MPP. For further insight into the way forward for Canada amid Donald Trump's trade wars, visit cdhow.org. I'm Michael Hainsworth. Thank you for joining us.
You've been listening to the C.D. Howe Institute podcast with Michael Hainsworth. Subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, and Spotify. The C.D. Howe Institute is an independent, not-for-profit research institute whose mission is to raise living standards by fostering economically sound public policies. The Institute is widely considered to be Canada's most influential think tank and a trusted source of essential policy intelligence, distinguished by nonpartisan, evidence-based research and subject to definitive expert review. Visit cdhow.org and follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Thank you.